What I want to talk about in this video is what I view as a very pernicious development, and that's the use by the Democrats, specifically by the squad or the Gang of Four, as I prefer to call them, of bogus historical comparisons. Trump is like Hitler. The detention camps on our southwestern border are like the concentration camps under the Nazis. And I know, I mean, you have a bunch of people in this country who buy into that, and then you have a bunch of people who don't. But even the people who don't usually dismiss it as hyperbole, political hyperbole. But I think it's much more dangerous than that, and that's what I want to talk about. I don't think you can understand how pernicious it is unless you understand how little young people in this country understand today. I mean, coming out of graduate school, maybe my first decade of teaching, I didn't really fully understand. But then something happened. It was 98, 99, whenever Saving Private Ryan came out, which really changed my view of my students and changed how I approached teaching. My then wife and I were down on Atlantic Beach, North Carolina on vacation. It was the week before school started. And we were there to see Saving Private Ryan. And behind me was a young couple. They were somewhere between 18 and 21, roughly around 20, two heteronormative people, guy and a girl. And the movie starts, and you have the opening scene, and then you have that they land on Omaha Beach, and arms are getting blown off, and people are dying left and right. And then finally they break out, and they get out over the seawall, and they get in behind the Germans, and that's when the Germans come out of their trenches, their bunkers, their pillboxes and all, and they're all putting their hands up and they're yelling, don't shoot, Nick shoot you, Nick shoot you, Nick shoot you. And some of the soldiers who are in this rage after what they've just been through on the beach, and all hyped up as they break through the seawall, start shooting the German prisoners, which is wrong. It's bad. You're not supposed to shoot prisoners when they surrender. But anything about warfare, that's not kind of uncommon, that midst of battle, that people's adrenaline is flowing, that this kind of stuff happens. The girl behind me says to her boyfriend, "That's why I hate this country. We're always going to these people's countries and mind their own business, and we go in and we invade them, then we just start shooting them up. This is terrible. It's like Vietnam. I mean, why do we keep doing this stuff? Why did we always do this stuff? This is horrible." And fortunately, the guy next to her knows a little bit more than that. And he says, "Well, honey, you don't understand. This is France. The Germans had invaded and occupied France, and we're there to get them out. The Germans are the bad guys." And it dawned on me then that, when Spielberg made this movie, and it's an excellent movie, I've seen it 3 times. I think it's a really good piece of work. But when he made it, he worked on the assumption that people knew what was going on there, that people knew why we were in Normandy, why we were there on D-Day. And this young woman next to me, she didn't know that. And it made me think, how much do my students actually know? So the following week, class started, and I decided I'd try an experiment. I gave them each an index card, and I had them write 1 to 10 on each one, and I gave them 10 questions. These weren't multiple choice. They had to actually see if they knew. And I don't remember all the questions, but one of them I remember. This is North Carolina, and I checked afterwards. There were 48 students in the class. They all had attended North Carolina public schools. I didn't have anybody from Neptune, New Jersey, or Catholic school or nothing. They were all 48 students from North Carolina public schools, mostly in Pitt County or other surrounding counties. Who was the president of the Confederacy? 48 students. One young woman knew. 1 out of 48 got it right. Some of the other answers were Sherman got like 3. 3 people that Sherman was the head of the Confederacy. Lincoln got 2. Grant got about 6. Lee had about 7. Stonewall Jackson had a couple of votes. Some of the people just left it blank. Actually, most of them did. And I thought, these people love their Southern heritage, or at least claim to, and 1 out of 48 of them even knows who the president of the Confederacy was. Another question I asked was, what were the dates of World War II? Now, I would have taken 39 to 45, 41 to 45, 35 to 45, 31 to 45 if you go with the Manchurian invasion by the Japanese, anything like that. The majority of the students didn't even get the right century. I was getting, 1600s, 1700s. I don't think any student had any of the correct dates. Not one out of 48. A couple of them thought it was in the 1950s. Who did we fight in World War One? Number one answer, the Japanese. Yeah, I mean, they were allies in World War One, but people thought, we fought the Japanese in World War One. I guess the Germans in World War Two. I don't know. I don't know what they thought. Who did we fight in the American Revolution? Now, remember, we're told today these kids understand the Constitution and the Second Amendment and the problems with the Electoral College. Who did we fight in the American Revolution? Number one answer, the blacks. I mean, it was like over 20 students said the blacks. I think 3 people said the British. A couple people said the French. A couple other people said the Mexicans. I mean, it wasn't even Mexico, didn't even exist in the 18th century. Yeah, they didn't know anything. Who did we fight in 1898? The Cubans. We invaded and fought the Cubans. I mean, no idea that we fought the Spanish. Pearl Harbor. What was Pearl Harbor? I think maybe about 6 people got it right. I think I had 4 students who told me it was where we opened the war with a nuclear strike against the Japanese. That's how Nagasaki and Pearl Harbor had come into case. Pearl Harbor was a Japanese place, and we nuked them on a surprise attack that started World War II. That's what these kids thought. And there were a couple other questions that just left me, gasping at the how little they knew. And what's amazing is both my kids went to public school, and I'm a historian. I'm a history professor, and I would go through their textbooks to see, what they were teaching them. And yeah, if I was teaching it, I had a little bit of different spin on it, but it's still all this stuff was all there. So I never understood. Did they just forget it? Did they not understand it? But when I started teaching U.S. military history a couple of years ago, John Tilley passed away, and I sort of inherited his course. And I started teaching the students. And one of the things I had them do at the end of the semester is for a cumulative essay, is to write a long essay. And the question I asked them is, if you imagine, okay, you've taken my course, and you run into somebody who says, "Hey, Jake, I'm thinking about taking Palmer's course on military history. What did you get out of it?" And I asked them, explain to me what they get out of it. And one of the things I hear over and over and over and over again in these essays, and these are all undergraduates. This is a 3,000 level course, so they're mostly juniors and seniors. "Professor Palmer, I had no idea we were involved in so many wars." And I think these things were in my book, and this is what I hear a lot of times. My teacher, like the Civil War, I knew about Civil War, I knew about slavery, but I really didn't know any of this other stuff. And she said, the teacher I had always skipped over the wars. So as we get to the American Revolution, they talk about maybe the Declaration, and they skip to the Constitution, and then they move on. Get to the Civil War, it breaks out, they skip to Reconstruction. They don't like to talk about military events. Maybe they think if they don't talk about it, it'll go away. I don't know. But I hear this a lot, and I have to conclude that the students aren't being well educated in North Carolina public schools, and I would assume other public schools. Now, why is this important? Because when it comes to things like Hitler and the Holocaust, students don't understand these things. They don't know. So what you might see, comparing Hitler to Trump is hyperbolic. For a student who doesn't know who Hitler was, it's not. It just means that this guy Hitler must be like Donald Trump. Must have been like Donald Trump. And you can see this. If you look at, there's all kinds of surveys, and when they ask students about the Holocaust, anywhere from a third to slightly under half don't even know what it was. They don't even know what the Holocaust was. The majority of young people in this country cannot identify Auschwitz. What was Auschwitz? I don't know. So if they don't know who Hitler was, and they don't understand the Holocaust, They don't know what Auschwitz was. When you have somebody comparing Trump to Hitler, what that means, what they're telling these kids who don't know who Hitler was, is that this guy Hitler, must have been like Donald Trump, except he didn't have orange hair. When you say that the camps on our southern borders are like Nazi death camps, Nazi concentration camps, then what you're teaching these kids is that the Nazi concentration camps during the Holocaust must have been like the camps on our border. You know, the Hungarian Jews at some point needed jobs, so they started marching their way north into Poland, and they got to Auschwitz, and where they were detained by the Nazis before they moved on to Germany to work. You know, and Adolf Eichmann was in charge of this. I mean, is that what they're going to think? And I mean, this is a real problem. This is why Alan Dershowitz gets it, because he wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago saying that comparing comparing the detention centers and Hitler to the concentration camp on the southern border, and the concentration camps and Hitler to concentration camps and Hitler, is Holocaust denial. Because what basically we're teaching our young people in this country, that again, Hitler, if Trump is Hitler, then Hitler was Trump. Hitler was a guy, didn't have blonde hair, he had a funny mustache, and he said nasty things about illegal immigrants. And he had these detention centers where he helped people who were trying to get into Germany to find jobs. That's what these camps were all about. That's what you're teaching them. Because you have to understand, to them, it's not hyperbolic. It's a history lesson. They're being taught that Adolf Hitler was like Donald Trump. Now, the reality is, of course, they're not. I mean, I don't know how many times I've had these confrontations on Facebook and various Slate chat rooms and other places where Trump's just like Hitler, you know, yada, 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 yada. You know, my response is pretty simple. If Trump was like Hitler, you would be in one of these camps. You wouldn't be sitting here on Facebook telling me that Trump's like Hitler. I mean, you know, you didn't get into a discussion in Nazi Germany and say, you know, Hitler's a terrible person and blah, 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 blah. You know, they'd round you up and you'd go off to camps. And the detention centers, I mean, yeah, the idea that Auschwitz is like a detention center. And I'm sure that the conditions in the detention centers are pretty piss poor. I mean, they're not designed for the number of people who are coming in. And of course, the answer would be stay home, don't come. But I mean, you know, Auschwitz, I mean, people checked in, they weren't, you know, forced to sit on the floor for a couple of days, or the kids weren't put in a cage. I mean, the children and were separated from each other, and from the parents. I mean, the men went here, the women went there. The children who could work, you know, lived. Children who couldn't work, exterminated, gassed, cremated. I mean, people checked in. I mean, 6 million Jews died out of 9 million in all of Europe. 2/3 of European Jews were dead, not forced to drink out of toilets. But, you know, that's not what the students are learning. The students are, well, you know, I wouldn't want to be in a concentration camp, but, you know, it's not that bad. So, you know, I get separated from my parents, and I live behind wire, and, you know, maybe, you know, we don't have a lot of water, or I don't get the kind of food I like, or the tacos are stale. I don't know. But I mean, I mean, you know, we are not like, you know, 100,000 people come into those camps and 2/3 of them die, or 100% of them die. That would be really like, you know, death camps. I mean, even the camps the Japanese in were by no means death camps. I mean, Japanese, I'm not saying that I mean, it was one of the big sins of this country to incarcerate these people and take their property, force them to sell their property or take it. I mean, it's a terrible thing. It's a blot on our history. Uh, but, you know, we didn't kill them. They didn't die. They didn't have enormous death rates. Actually, considering most of them weren't fighting in World War II, I actually had a case came up with a student once who claimed that they had this enormous death rate. And I actually got all the numbers and worked it out. They had a slightly lower death rate than the population at large, because most of them weren't being drafted. I mean, I know some did fight and they fought very well. Most of the Japanese were not being enlisted. They weren't forced to enlist. So they weren't dying in World War II. So actually, for in that generation, the death rate was actually higher than the death rate of the white and African American death rate, which was much higher because of combat losses. Uh, so, I mean, this is it's just all this stuff is flowing around, but to understand truly how pernicious it is, you have to understand that these kids don't know these things. They don't they don't know any history. They don't know who Hitler was. You know, like I said, most of the young people in this country, more than half, can't identify Auschwitz. I think I remember another one a couple of years ago where it was like 75% of American high school graduates couldn't locate the United States on an unlabeled map. I mean, it was just a map of the world with lines, but no captions. You know, United States, Mexico wasn't on there. You know, 3/4 of them couldn't find the country on a map. So you have to, and when you understand that the young people today really know jack shit. I mean, the idea that they can comprehend the Trump-Hitler comparison in a sensible way, or the Auschwitz detention camp comparison in a sensible way, or that they understand the ins and outs of the Second Amendment or the Electoral College. I mean, forget it. These kids, one time in a writing intensive history class I was teaching, this is 3,000 levels, again, juniors and seniors. And I asked them, I said, you know, I was giving about before you write your first essay, you hear 10 things students get wrong. One of them I mentioned was, you know, use active instead of passive voice. And I just looked out and I saw some quizzical expressions. And I had been saying, don't use passive voice, use active voice since I had become a graduate assistant back in the 70s, because that's what my teachers always told me, use active voice, avoid passive voice whenever you can, avoid passive voice whenever you can. And here I am 20 years later, 25 years later, teaching. And, you know, I look out there and I wonder, it suddenly hit me because I had already had this experience with history. You know, what did they really know? So I said, who can explain to me the difference between active and passive voice? Now, again, 30 students, no, it's 25 students, writing intensive course. You know how many hands went up? None, not one. No student in college, junior level, could explain, you know, active and passive voice, which is, I mean, I don't know, third grade, fourth grade, we learned, you know, John threw the ball is thrown by John. I mean, this isn't rocket science. But there I am teaching 25 kids, North Carolina public schools, ostensibly got here by passing English, had already had 2 semesters of English, 2 semesters of English at ECU they'd already taken. And out of 25 of them, not one can identify active and passive voice. Now, to make things worse, that night I went into my graduate class, and there were 13 of them, and I said, who can explain who would like to explain the difference between active and passive voice to the rest of the class? One woman put her hand up, and it took a while before that went up. The rest of them were like, I don't know. I don't think most of them even knew. So I don't know what the state of our education is these days. I know people keep telling me we need to spend more money. I don't know that we need to spend more money for them to learn what I learned in the 4th grade from some nun that, you know, John threw the ball was thrown by John. But we don't know these things. They don't know any history. I hear all the time in my students, you know, my number one thing I hear in these essays is my teacher skipped over the wars. I mean, wars. Why do we want to talk about wars? What did they do? I mean, how do you explain American independence without understanding the fight against England? So as a result, the kids who did we fight in the revolution? The blacks. Actually, when I asked about who fought in the Civil War, it's really crazy. Who fought? These are, you know, young Confederates and, you know, Confederate pride and all that. Who fought in the American Civil War? The answer: the whites and the blacks, not the North and the South. The number one answer I got was the whites and the blacks, which of course was the people we fought in the American Revolution. I think when I asked them about the War of 1812, who did we fight, the blacks was the number one answer. Uh, I mean, these kids have no conception. You talk about the Southerners and the flag and all this stuff. Maybe they know what the flag is, and maybe a lot of them like it, but they don't. They know jack shit about anything involving the Confederacy or any of these things for the most part. Even, and these are young kids in North Carolina, the products of our public schools. And that's why this stuff that's being said today by the Gang of Four, the squad, is so pernicious. And the things that are being said by the left. If Trump is like Hitler, then to people who don't know who Hitler was, Hitler becomes nothing more than Donald Trump without orange hair. And if the detention camps are like the Nazi death camps, then the Nazi concentration camps are no worse than what's going on our southern border. And that's just pure bullshit. But that's what is being fed to these kids. And no doubt, a lot of them, when they can vote, they'll vote for these sane people because they don't know anything. And I don't know what the answer to this is, other than bulldozing the schools over and start all over again, because something's not working in this country, and it's a shame.